You're listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Here are your hosts, Fran Chismar and Tom Kinesic.
This will be a show I know absolutely nothing about. Welcome back to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. I am Fran Chismar.
And I'm Tom Kinesic, and welcome to episode 40 of the only show that the host advice will get you killed. And I also don't know a lot about today's topic, but I know more than you do.
You do. So. You do. And I'm definitely curious, and I know our listeners are as well. You had posted in the Facebook group a little bit ago, if anyone had questions, and it went wild with questions.
Yeah, it's something that we've seemed to approach at times on the previous episodes of the podcast, but we never really got into it other than saying, "Oh, yeah, this is something you can eat."
Yeah,
but
well, my one experience,
we haven't really dove into it fully.
And the reasoning is my one experience is, and I've mentioned it before. Your father asked me if winter berries were edible, and I told him yes, and they're not. So it's I'm not someone to give advice on this topic. I should stay away from it because I realize I don't know. Yeah. But I'm going to put my learning cap on today, and I have a cap on anyway because we have no heat. So I'm glad we just happen to walk in the office to no heat today, and I'm glad this one isn't on video because I'm sitting here like all shivering and muddled up. But I have my learning cap on, and I am ready to absorb.
Yeah, me too. It's a topic I've really, like we've said before, my brother is really into, I don't want to say living off the land, but finding things in the woods that he can consume. And I've always wanted to take that step, but I'm not the best with plant ID all the time, so I'd never really felt confident enough to get into it. So I'm ready to learn.
Yeah, and I've mentioned before too, my fiance and her mother both having grown up in Poland, having a farm and foraged for mushrooms, and it was part of their culture. And she's kind of lost that. So she's interested. Yeah. I'm interested. It's a perfect time.
Yeah. So with that, I want to say today's guest is a Hall of Fame forager, author, and all around just interesting guy. Just reading up on him on the internet and hearing things about him, I'm captivated by everything he has going on. We're really honored to have on today Sam Thayer. So Sam,
I'm honored to be here. But I got to ask you something.
Yeah.
I'm getting you guys mixed up because I can't see your faces. But who is saying that he has no experience foraging?
That's Fran. It's me.
Yeah.
Fran. Okay. So, have you ever picked blueberries before?
You know what? I have picked low bush blueberries before. That's one because it's something we sell, and then I'm confident on my ID. And I actually had kids picking it on a scout camping trip, and I got yelled at for having them.
Here's the fascinating thing that I find is that the people, when people gather something growing wild to eat, they don't consider that foraging. Mm-hmm. So if I ask a group of 100 people, maybe a somewhat random crowd, how many of you forage for wild food? And 23 hands go up out of 100. And then I say, if I'm around here, I'll say, how many of you have picked wild blueberries? And every hand goes up. Mm-hmm. So, there's more people picking blueberries than foraging. Well, how is that possible? Because they don't consider it foraging, because if they do it, it's normal.
Yeah.
And foraging sounds weird. And when I got into foraging, it was when I was a little kid. It was because I was hungry. And it wasn't foraging, it was just food. It was just a way to get food I had discovered. I didn't even learn the term foraging pertaining to this activity of mine until I was in my 20s. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I found it kind of offensive for the first 5 or 6 years. Like it suggested aimless wandering, searching for food. And I was like, no, I know where this stuff is. I'm just going to get it. So I would tell people I was a gatherer, or I would say I'm berry picking. I didn't use the term foraging until recently when the media decided that it was like the term for this activity.
Yeah. I think the only two things I've ever picked wild and eaten are low bush blueberry and blackberry when I was out in Oregon on business. There was wild blackberry neighboring one of the farms we were on, and someone ID'd and said, you should try these. We eat these all the time. That was probably the only thing, but I didn't do it because I was hungry. I did it to try it. Like I was like, oh, I know this and I know I can eat it. Let's try it. But I've never done it to sustain myself or to take it home. If that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it still counts. It still counts.
Okay. Now, my fiance, I've told this story before. Growing up in Poland, her grandfather taught her how to forage for mushrooms, and one of the interesting tactics were they didn't know all the mushrooms, but he taught her that if you're not sure if it's poisonous or not, stick the tip of your tongue on the gills of the mushroom. Just not lick it, but put your tongue there, and if it tingles, then it's poisonous. Stay away from it. Like that was their barometer for foraging mushrooms.
I recommend avoiding any such simplified rule like that. But what's interesting is that rural people develop little folk tests like that. But if you actually look into it, it's usually more specific than that. Like, for example, say her grandfather, rural Polander, said that, right?
Yes.
But there was another mushroom. There maybe you went to put your tongue on a mushroom, and he would say, no, don't put your tongue on that one, right?
Yeah.
So the rule is not as broadly applied as it sounds like. Kind of like when somebody gives you instructions for something, and it's real brief instructions, and they forgot about 16 contingencies that you're going to trip over. So when we hear these rules, the person actually foraging wasn't the only rule they had. This was a rule that they had that they applied in a situation, and it got kind of carried on into the next generation who wasn't doing that as this kind of simplified rule. But if you apply a simplified rule like that broadly, eventually it's going to get you into trouble. Maybe not the first time, but eventually it'll get you into trouble.
And it's funny that sometimes you don't realize that until you're doing it. We're doing a practice at work where we're writing out standard operating procedures, and I picked one purposefully thinking it would be the easiest one to do, and I could describe it in 10 steps. And I'm about 40 steps in. Yeah. And I was just like, oh, I forgot about all these things. It's really not as simple as I think. In my head, I think it's simple. But if I had to explain it to someone, it's really nowhere near that simple. There's a lot of factors that I didn't even think about.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that your fiance is from Poland because here in the Midwest, there's a large Polish community in the Chicago area.
Okay.
And I get a lot of Polish people in my edible plant workshops, and just to apply some broad generalizations here, they are the best students. And it's really nice, and a lot of times they've taught me some things that I didn't know. But also I had a great moment with one Polish woman who's been to a number of my workshops talking about the cow parsnip, the native cow parsnip, which there's a very close relative in Europe, which is goes by the name borscht or something very similar in Polish.
Yeah.
And she said, no, that's a soup. I said, yeah, but the soup is named for this plant. And, of course, we're in the modern age. She said, well, I'm going to text my grandma in Poland right now. And so she texts her grandma, is there a plant called borscht? And she didn't get a response for like 6 minutes, and we're in the middle of the class, and dings, and she says, oh, you're right. And she has a picture of the European cow parsnip, which is only slightly different. It actually does. I found it growing feral in New York City 2 years ago, the European cow parsnip.
Oh, wow.
But it's really similar to our native cow parsnip.
I found it interesting with Agatha because growing up in communist Poland, they definitely were more in touch with the land because they had to be. They depended on it. And they had a forest that was part of their property, so that was part of their everyday. And it's something that I think a lot of us have never had to rely on. So you don't think about it, or you don't know as much.
Yeah, and that's why there's been an explosion in books written about foraging, right? So it's the opposite of what we think, but when everybody does something, there's nothing written about the topic. And then as it becomes less common, then there will be things written about it. So you can't go to the store right now and you can't buy a book called How to Drive a Car.
Yeah.
Because everybody knows how to do that for the most part. It's part of our common cultural knowledge. But similarly, as fewer and fewer people cook at home, there's been an unbelievable proliferation of cookbooks. So some people think that foraging is becoming more popular, and that's why we're seeing a lot of media coverage and books about it. But actually, I think the opposite trend has been going on steadily now for the last few thousand years, and it's still continuing. But we're seeing more and more media coverage of it.
Yeah, I think with the pandemic, a lot of our listeners had questions because they wanted to start doing more sustainable things on their own property or just be able to fend for themselves.
And even I've mentioned before, I listened to a lot of hunting podcasts. Actually, how I became familiar with Sam was through a hunting podcast where they mentioned he written a part in a book. They were pushing. But the hunting population has grown during the pandemic because more people, the supermarket doesn't have as much food. I live in a rural or suburban area where I can hunt and maybe I could source some of my own food, and that's kind of even fueled my own pursuit into the foraging aspect with plants. Is I hunt, I fish, I dabble with like blueberries and blackberries and some of the things I know I can consume, but I'm really interested in the concept of, okay, this is a deer I shot and these were the foods that it was around and possibly eating in the wild as well. I'm actually pairing those instead of your regular baked potato and broccoli or whatever you have in the freezer or fridge at home. I want to actually source that home meal and say, hey, this was from the woods that's right behind our house. Everything on the plate was from there, and that's what we found with our listeners as well. But as I mentioned in the preamble, it's kind of daunting when you don't know all the plants. Yeah. And like, where do you start?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And the great thing about foraging is you don't need to know all the plants.
Okay.
You just need to know one plant, and the plant you're going to eat. That's the only one you need to know. And so I will often tell people that learning foraging is like learning a language. There's an incredible amount to it, and it takes years to actually become fluent. On the other hand, it's not like a language in that if you know one word in Japanese and you go to Japan, you're not going to be able to communicate, right? But if you know one food, you can eat that food. There's no limit to how you can apply that knowledge. So I tell people the place to start is a place you frequent. Maybe your backyard. Maybe it's a woods where you go camping frequently.
Okay.
A park you often walk your dog, wherever, just someplace you frequent. And the plant you start with is a plant you see a lot. And then you identify it. And that might take you a while. Identifying plants for somebody who's just getting into plant identification can be daunting.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? There's daunting things in life. It's not supposed to always be easy. Just do it. And you can, of course, ask a knowledgeable person if you have a knowledgeable person you trust that you can ask. But it's better to get some resources, get a few books, and actually go through the process yourself of identifying that plant. It might take you a couple of years. If you can't identify this one you picked out, then pick out another one and try to identify a different one that you see frequently. And when you learn its name, then you find out if it's edible. Mm-hmm. Now, some people tell me they only want to learn the edible plants, and that's like saying I only want to learn beautiful words because I want to write poetry, so I don't want to learn the boring words, just the poetic ones. You've got to learn the whole language to write poetry.
Yeah.
So if you're going to identify, edible plants, you need to learn something about plants. So just find one and identify it. If it turns out that it's not edible, you didn't hurt yourself one bit. Then just find another one and identify that one, and you're not going to have to go far until you find something that's edible.
Yeah.
And so start that way, or start with the plant you already know. Maybe you know what a black walnut is. You've heard that they're edible. You've just never done anything with it. Just get off your butt and figure out how to make something out of black walnuts. Yeah. So you start with one plant, and you start in a place you frequent. And then it's not so daunting.
Yeah, it's funny. I'm pretty confident in my ability to ID plants until I have to eat it. Then all of a sudden my confidence goes out the window. But
at the same time, we're living in an age where it's almost as easy. It's almost too easy to identify plants with all the apps out there. You don't have to collect samples, bring it back to your textbook, or lug the textbooks into the woods to go through that key and figure out what it is. Now you can take a picture, and depending on how much you trust your app, you know what it is right then and there.
But it's funny, black walnut is actually one of the first trees I learned, because I learned that when you throw them at each other and they hit your clothes and you have them on your hands, they stain the tannins stain your clothes and your hands. So that was...
And they could hurt.
Yeah, they do hurt.
I threw one at my cousin Katie when I was 10. I didn't mean to hit her. I was just trying to throw it at the chicken shed at my grandma's house, and I wasn't that coordinated, and I hit her right in the head.
Oh.
It's just traumatic. She doesn't even remember it, but I remember it. I mean, I felt so horrible. Black walnut was one of the first trees that I learned, but I learned it as a food. My grandpa liked to eat them, and I was probably 5 years old when he taught me a black walnut, and I never forgot. I still eat them to this day. Literally, I ate some this day.
Wow. And it's funny, even not just, when I think of foraging, I think immediately of fruit or nuts. And that's the first thing my brain kind of goes to. But I was out with my fiance at a park, and I can't remember what tree was blooming, but she's like, oh, these blooms are edible. Like, we used to take these and eat these blooms. That's something I hadn't even considered as far, even though I had known that, it's something that my brain hadn't even processed.
Everything you might be able to buy and eat, like every class of produce item, there's like 30 times that diversity in wild plants. So we eat like flower buds, right, of broccoli.
Yeah.
But as far as flower bud clusters just before they open that you could eat that you could forage in your area, there's at least 30.
Yeah.
I mean, there's just tons of them. We eat, as far as shoot vegetables, like we eat asparagus, and that's about it. I guarantee you there's probably more than 30. There's probably more like 70 different shoot vegetables that you could eat just in your area. So, yeah, the diversity of what you can eat is remarkable. But I want to also get back to that thing, mentioning apps. I don't know today if there's any apps that I would trust. I highly doubt it.
Yeah.
You got to so one thing about foraging is it does require this level of certainty. And I call this contradictory confidence. This is the confidence that if someone told you were wrong, you would contradict them, right? So I use the banana example. I tell people it has to pass the banana test. Like, let's say you were eating a banana, right?
Okay.
And I said, hey, I'm a botanist, and I'm telling you that's not a banana. That's a deadly false banana. You'd laugh at me.
Yeah.
You'd tell me I was full of crap.
Yeah.
And so that's where you would need to be to eat anything. And you may think, well, but bananas are so distinct. Actually, the cultivated plants we eat are no more distinct than the wild plants we don't eat. It's just that they don't look distinct and familiar because we have not yet gone through that process of familiarizing ourselves with the plants. So if I was to have a head of iceberg lettuce and green cabbage, anybody who's grown up making coleslaw and salad isn't going to confuse those plants at all. It's inconceivable that they would accidentally make shredded cabbage salad thinking it was iceberg lettuce. It's not going to happen. And yet, I could bring the same two things to a group of 14-year-old boys. I know this because I did this, and I had like 3 out of 40 some that could tell the two apart.
Wow.
Right? And people think they look exactly the same. They're not familiar with them. And so this is when you hear that two wild plants are lookalikes, they're almost never more alike than cabbage and lettuce. So everybody can make every relevant distinction. Everybody has it within them. You just have to gain the familiarity, which is not instant. And so there's really a process you need to go through with each plant you learn. But once you learn it, you have it forever. You are never going to go eat a blackberry and be like, wait a second, maybe this is a deadly false blackberry. Right? It's just not going to happen. But foraging does require that additional level of confidence, and it requires some cognitive work on the part of the doer. No app is going to do it, and no book is going to do it without you being a robust participant in the process. And so this is something that a person who grows up foraging knows, and they know it from so early in life that they don't really consider how big of a thing it is that they know. But for people who have foraged very little, it's hard to wrap your brain around that level of confidence is clicking in. I'll give you an example of how powerful this is. During the Lewis and Clark expedition, when they were returning from the West Coast, these 30 or so men, they were very hungry, and they were trading with the native people for the dried roots of 3 carrot family root vegetables that they were subsisting on for months: meat and these dried root vegetables. Okay. And one person in camp, Sacagawea, knew how to identify those, and she was gathering them around camp every single day for her people in her lodging, right? Okay. And the leaders, Lewis and Clark, they would not allow any of their white boys to go out and gather those plants because they were afraid they would kill themselves or somebody. And so they went miles every single day. They sent out 2 men, 20, 30, 40 miles on horseback to trade a village super valuable stuff. They took all the buttons off all their coats to trade for this food because they were afraid that they would get it wrong. The 16-year-old girl was going to get it right because she had grown up thinking that way, but he didn't trust a single one of his men to gather those plants. So you do need this level of confidence that we are not accustomed to acting with but in this day and age. But
the payout is incredible. For me, the one takeaway I had from the time I picked wild blackberries is that it ruined blackberries for me. Anytime that I buy blackberries from a store, I keep hoping that they taste the way they taste it when I had them off the bush, and they never do. It completely ruined it for me. But I keep trying. It's been 20 years, and I still haven't come close to that.
Yeah, the payout is the best food on earth, both flavor-wise, nutritionally, and I would say spiritually, how you feel when you eat them and go through that process.
Yeah. Oh, totally. So we
have a lot of questions for you, so I want to move along a little bit.
Sure.
And I know this is another trick question for you, but we wanted to know what's the best season for foraging. And I'm sure that's kind of probably you can do it in every season. So maybe you even share some of the highlights of each season with us.
Sure. I mean, for me, fall is definitely the peak of my foraging year. Okay. So I mean, spring is a time of greens and shoot vegetables. Very early spring is a great time for root vegetables. But in the spring and early summer, I am foraging just for stuff I'm eating that day. Okay. And I eat a fair amount of leafy greens, and in general, I would say the easiest way that you can improve your health and save money at the same time with foraging is to learn 10 or 15 common leafy greens in your area, because we don't eat enough leafy greens in our diet. And I don't need to go into detail in terms of why, but that's an incredible way to improve your health and save money and get the best leafy greens in the world. But when you get to midsummer, you start getting fruit ripening. And we start to collect a little bit more fruit, save a little bit of stuff for the winter. By late summer, when we're picking blueberries, we're starting to put up food for the year. I mean, our family goes on blueberry picking expeditions. Last year, we froze or canned or dried 78 gallons of wild blueberries. That's a lot of fruit.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
And then, and it's kind of like this steadily increasing. It reaches a crescendo in October. There's more fruit. The fruit gets bigger. You get stuff like wild plums and persimmons and apples and pawpaws in the fall. So all the big fruit ripens in the fall, and then you get nuts, the big crops. And we collect lots of acorns and hickory nuts and walnuts and butternuts. and then basically I'm foraging like crazy until either the ground freezes solid or the snow covers the ground.
Okay.
And then winter is my time for processing, right?
All right.
I'm cracking nuts, I'm shelling nuts, I'm grinding flours, I'm, doing stuff like that. So, foraging is half gathering and half cooking.
Mm-hmm.
So the preparation part doesn't slow down at all in the winter. So I don't really feel like there's a big foraging lull in the winter. I do go through a period where I'm like, man, I want to pick some leafy greens, or there's a few teas we can gather in the winter, but not much to gather. And then probably our biggest, most intense harvest of the year is maple syrup, which is the end of winter,
mm-hmm.
and then the cycle kind of starts again. So, but at your latitude, there's a little bit to collect through most of the winter. You get down to a place like Houston, Tallahassee, whatever, in the deep south. Winter's actually a great time for foraging a lot of leafy greens. So it's slower in the winter, and there's even quite a few winter fruits that ripen in the south.
I didn't even think of syrup, and that's something that actually your dad does. He does
they're
birch
boiling
syrup.
red maple sap today.
Yeah.
They got maybe 10 gallons, and we don't make a lot. We only make a little bit that we share amongst our family. But I never even thought about that as a foraging practice.
Either did I.
Yeah, it's too normal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Weird, that's just totally normal.
And I just wanted to real quick, and I know you touched on it and said we don't need to go into the reasons why, but the leafy greens, and that's something that we've touched about on numerous episodes of the podcast is, plants are the resource for capturing the sun's energy, and by eating those, you're getting that direct transference of energy from the plant. So they're extremely important. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, and human beings instinctively try to increase our calorie density, because if you ever forage for 100% of your food, you'll realize that it's actually hard to fit enough calories into your digestive system. And so that is actually the hard part with foraging isn't finding enough calories, it's fitting enough into your intestines over the long term.
Yeah.
And so greens are not calorie dense. And so they historically, evolutionarily, were a really important part of the human diet. Because they're super available and super labor efficient, right? But we instinctively look for the high calorie density foods, and then we exclude the low calorie density but highly nutritious foods like leafy greens, or any fruit with a very strong flavor, which usually indicates high levels of antioxidants and anthocyanins and vitamins and minerals. And so we instinctively avoid the best foods for us. So we need to override that a little bit and look at the longer picture, because you start eating leafy greens a lot, you realize that you feel pretty darn good when you eat a lot of them. And I don't mean tons and tons, but eat them every day.
Yeah.
And
so one of the things you kind of mentioned, even you said you had black walnut today, but how much of your, I guess, weekly diet, monthly diet, yearly diet is things that you've actually foraged, or I guess you could say bartered for, that were forged someplace?
So, I don't really keep track of that, real precisely.
Mm-hmm.
I have at times, but it gets boring, But it's probably half of our diet, and sometimes we go for periods just because we want to challenge ourselves and say, hey, let's eat just wild for this week or whatever. I think we got one coming up this spring. We're going to do that for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Or, we raise a few chickens and stuff, and we have ducks or eggs, so we might do just like the no grocery store for a month.
Mm-hmm.
But, it's been that way steady about half my diet for more than 20 years.
Wow.
And it's, I started foraging when I was a little kid. So I feel like it's really easy to replace a good portion of your diet. The hard parts are the cheap foods, like the starchy foods, the beans, the wheat, the rice. Those are the things that are hard to supplant with wild gathered stuff.
Now, I know this is going to take us off topic just a tad, and we can steer back, but you were mentioning that cooking is a large part of foraging throughout the year. Are there favorite recipes that you have? Is there something in particular that you make from something that you forage? You're like, this is better than anything else that you can get.
So sometimes I have trouble giving people recipes because the food that's in my pantry is so different enough from the food in other people's pantry that they often can't even relate to what I'm talking about. But like something, pretty simple, like we'll do, wild rice, maple syrup, and hickory nuts as a breakfast cereal.
Wow.
And it doesn't get any better than that.
Wow.
And real wild rice that actually tastes good, by itself, where you don't have to dilute it because it's, tastes kind of musty. But actual wild rice, it has that good fresh grain flavor, really great. But then there's other cereals I could say my absolute favorite breakfast cereal is like Wapato. Well, nobody has Wapato, but I can tell you, I dry it, like I boil it. It's a root, it's a tuber. I boil it and I crumble it and then I roast it in small pieces. Now after it's roasted, I'll put it through a coarse flour grinder and it's like a cornmeal-like texture. Then I rehydrate that like a hot cereal. And then I like it with wild strawberries in it. But any, raspberries, blueberries, whatever. A little bit of milk, the only non-wild thing I put in there, and you don't have to have it in there. And some hickory nuts. And oh my goodness, that is like the ultimate breakfast cereal.
That sounds good. That sounds really good, actually. Now my stomach's starting to rumble a little bit.
And that's
but you can't envision it because you've probably never had Wapato in your mouth. That flavor, that's like sweet corn with a touch of grapefruit. Like, what on earth? You can't compare it to anything. Like that's why I describe it, and people think, well, that doesn't sound right. It's like, it doesn't sound right, but man, it's right. It's perfectly right.
Well, it's funny now that we're saying this, and I was saying, my experience is low as far as foraging, but I'm thinking now all the things that I've eaten here because of working here, like I've had duck potato. That Tom's father had harvested and brought in. Tom made fritters out of elderberry flowers, and I've had that here. So yeah, there's definitely, now that I'm thinking about it, I've had more than I thought I did.
Yeah, I tried to tell you in the beginning of the conversation. the lines are more blurry than you think. As long as you let them be blurry, then who knows how much you've had? Because everything you eat was wild and foraged somewhere at some point.
Yeah. It's now, given that, and this is something you grew up doing, are there historical references that you've used or places that you go to check to see how it was used in the past, like how Native Americans had used it, or if something was usable beforehand? Do you reference some of this stuff as you go into territory that you're unfamiliar with?
Oh, that's like, I spend so much of my time doing that. It's a blast. It's I have a whole library with 1,000 books and thousands of research papers and stuff. So I mean, I use, the starting point for a lot of people is Merman's Ethnobotany. It's like an encyclopedic book, or you can look up a plant and it'll list Native American uses that the author found that were documented generally by white people, later interviewing Native people whose food cultures were semi-intact or sometimes more so. And it'll list the plant and a very brief description of the use. And if you're diligent, you can go back and find the original source. The older ones are almost all not copyrighted anymore, so they're available online. And you can read what was actually said about how these plants were used. And I'm doing that all the time. I mean, look up, but also archaeology. So there's a lot of plants that were used in eastern North America, but we have no historical written evidence or ethnographic evidence of them being used because the native cultures were displaced rapidly before any of that information was recorded, and may have been, say, moved to Oklahoma or Iowa or someplace further west from an eastern state where the same vegetation didn't grow, and so that the traditions have been lost. And so uncovering and recreating those things through very sparse historical records or archaeological records is really fun. Maybe some people would say daunting, but I say fun. And there's also a lot of the same plants in Europe as North America. So currently I'm reading a book that was written by a Swiss author in the 1920s that's not in English, but is referencing old sources that he was finding at that time, European sources, and compiling them about native North temperate plants around the world, and he's got 740 species. Really fascinating stuff, and a lot of plants that are obscure but maybe common and good foods. So, and the beauty of this is, like, if you just look in the edible wild plant field guides, there's really just a few things, and they mostly focus on what I would call European farmer folk knowledge that is still alive today. And there's nothing wrong with that knowledge, but it's limited in what it covers. Whereas, my wife and I have been in this like 20-some year project. Well, I started 20-some years ago to like rekindle this tradition of making hickory nut oil, which I can find no evidence of anybody making in North America for about 170 years.
Wow.
Yet it was a major staple food. It was a significant industry. The native people were trading with European settlers for 200 or 300 years, hickory oil, and the tradition is dead.
Wow.
And this is like something that's sitting right before our eyes. And I don't know when's the, right time to get into this, but you had talked about, we were going to speak about, is it possible to give back as much as we take?
That was
and the sustainability of foraging.
Yeah, our listeners
were
really concerned about their footprint. Like, can they take too much? Can they give back? Like, that was a huge concern that came up immediately.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it should be. And this is, so I guess what I was just saying about this lost knowledge is kind of a segue into that topic and that question, which for me is the biggest part of why I'm so deeply fascinated with foraging. I grew up hungry and eating wild things, but I grew up as a lover of nature. It was my place to get away from my horrible family. Like just to get out in the woods and not come home until dark.
Yeah.
And then go to bed and avoid them. That was kind of my process as a child. And if I was going to be away from my family, I had to have something to eat when I was out in the woods.
Yeah.
And so, the idea of nature being destroyed was just weighed heavily on me as a child. I became a Nature Conservancy volunteer when I was 14.
Wow.
I became a certified Nature Conservancy spokesperson when I was 17. I mean, I was volunteering in prairie restoration and licking envelopes to send out. And I mean, I was, participating in prairie burns. And one of my huge interests still is, reptile and amphibian conservation and native plant conservation. So this is really important to me. But what is also important to me is this bigger picture that for 300,000 years, Homo sapiens lived as gatherers and hunters, with some notable and important exceptions, without destroying nature.
Yeah.
And recently, about 500 years ago, we had the beginning of what we call, the colonial period. And we often don't step back and look at where we are in history. We're at the close of the colonial period. And right now, like this is in 3,000 years, that's what they're going to state. 2000, the year 2000 was roughly the close of the colonial period. And this is a big deal. So people from a small part of the world took over all of the rest of the surface of the globe in 300 years.
Wow.
And in that process, they used to justify that, morally, a colonial mythology. And there's two really important components of that colonial mythology. And one of them is that humans don't belong in nature. And another one is that nature is worthless. And I said there's two, but really there's three, because those two combine into this really important one, which is humans that live in nature are not humans, right? And so these are fundamental to the civilized thought process for the entire period of colonialism. Hunter-gatherers are not people. Nature is worthless, and people do not belong in nature. When you put these three things together, you cannot have a sustainable relationship to nature. It is impossible. And so we have been destroying cultural knowledge that did not fit in with this colonial mythology. So I mentioned hickory oil, right?
Yeah.
Now, we have a particular hickory in North America, our most common, most widespread, bitternut hickory. It is literally like an economically perfect gift to humankind from nature as an oilseed crop, I'll go out on a limb and say, not on a limb actually at all, I'm right next to the trunk and I'm holding really tight. This is better than the olive in terms of its economic potential. And it is, if the olive were native to North America, today it would be relegated to like a no place, a nothing. It would be a historical footnote. It would be worthless garbage. That's exactly how we think of our native, unbelievable oil crop, the young bud hickory, right?
Yeah.
And so when I go to farmers and ask about picking their hickory nuts to make oil, literally they mean, oh, you mean the trash hickory? I'm like, yeah, the trash hickory. So that is how we think of this gift. Like if we want a sustainable culture, we need this knowledge desperately. We cannot have a sustainable food culture unless we accept that the food that's here is food and it's real and it's worth something. So if nature is worthless, the only way we can get what we need is to destroy nature and replace it. And this idea is deeply embedded even in the conservation and environmental movements.
Yeah.
Give you an example, I had a little bit of a disagreement on paper with a person representing a native plant society who said that it's not okay to collect elderberries from the wild, but we can plant elderberry on like say on our property, and then we'll provide wildlife habitat and elderberries for ourselves to eat. So what she's saying there implies that nature by itself cannot produce a sustainably harvestable surplus. But nature, when it's recreated by human hands, can do that, right? And so that is like this psychological stumbling point that civilized people have about our relationship to nature that like makes it impossible to have a sustainable relationship. And so for me, the knowledge of these wild plants it's the first building blocks of a sustainable culture. It is possible to overharvest things. Absolutely. Does it happen? Occasionally. I think we hear about it 1,000 times disproportionately to how often it actually happens.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of myths about it floating around out there. And those, like when we have a deep belief, it finds a way to seep to the surface. So, I don't even like to participate in foraging discussions online because there's so much of this.
We don't like having native plant conversations online either.
Yeah, just arguing over, like somebody shows a picture of anything they gathered and someone else says, you gathered too much.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is when you go out there and you put your hands on the plant and then you take your hands and you bring that plant to your mouth and you eat it, there's something magical that happens. And it happens in your brain. And we actually have a word for it. It's called gratitude. Mm-hmm. Every language has a word for gratitude. And gratitude is not something that like hippies made up in the 60s. Gratitude has existed as long as human beings have existed because it's a natural response of us to the landscape that supports us. And by eating those wild plants, that gratitude grows in our brain and makes us feel deeply connected. And all outdoor activities build that gratitude, but none of them build it as strongly, as firmly, or as keenly as gathering and eating food. None of them. And everybody who forages knows that. And so I don't need to preach to the people that are foragers about conservation. I only need to share the details because I know the desire to act right in accordance with the landscape is in them. The desire is there. They care. You cannot forage without caring. Now, there's a few people that are commercial harvesters that really don't care because they're not eating what they're harvesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, people that forage deeply care. And I'm not saying commercial harvesters don't deeply care either, because I am blessed to be part of the living wild rice tradition here in the Midwest. I learned directly from the unbroken Native American tradition, and I participate in it now. And it is not there's no racial boundaries to this tradition. There's lots of Native Americans, there's lots of white people, and there's a number of Asian people that harvest wild rice up here. And the commercial harvesters, I say people like me, I sell some rice every year. There's thousands of us who sell some rice every year. We are just as keenly interested in this as the people who are not selling any. In terms of the conservation, and we are the ones who have protected the wild rice. In the areas that don't have a living rice tradition, the rice has been destroyed. There are forces here. There are people who really, really want to get rid of the wild rice, desperately want to get rid of it, and we are the ones who have stopped them.
You know, if one of the things that we've noticed, and this podcast has been such a learning experience for Tom and myself as we've progressed through this now almost a year now. Three of our most popular episodes, and I'd say Dr. Enrique Sala from National Geographic, Doug Tallamy, and Benjamin Vogt, all kind of echoed a very similar sentiment that most humans feel as though they're the center of the universe, and the plants and the wildlife and everything kind of revolve around them, where it should be the soil is the universe, plants are the sun, and none of us can survive without them, and you have to change your way of thinking. It's we talk about things like deer numbers being out of whack and eating all the native understory, which are affecting everything else. We can do that as well because our numbers are out of whack and we can overharvest. And even the last episode, Dr. Emil DeVito was talking about the town of Caviar in Delaware who shipped all their sturgeon eggs out for caviar and then thought God had forsaken them because there was no more sturgeon in the ocean. So it's you have to change your way of thinking, that we are part of nature. You have to get that connectivity back. Otherwise, the whole system's out of whack. So I completely relate to what you're saying, and I completely appreciate the passion in which you're saying it. And certainly. There's too many people for everybody to go gather unlimited everything, anything, anytime they want. But there's not too many people for everybody to gather a substantial portion of their food. And that may sound crazy, but if it does, that means you haven't thought about it very much, because right now we get our food from the land. And there is actually a huge portion of the biomass is not planted and tended still. It's roughly 18% of the world's land surface is cultivated, and that's even within that system, there's a lot of not intentionally grown food. So some people will say, well, should only gather invasive plants, or you should only gather the non-natives or the weedy plants. And I would say you should gather the things that you can gather sustainably. And then there's people who see foraging as only a negative, like you only take. And that's part of our mythology of the stupid savage that the colonialists made up, right? So they refused to see what was happening. So you saw native people in the Pacific Northwest with these camas meadows, where they were gathering this wild camas from these beautiful meadows of camas. Well, these were giant permaculture camas meadows that were intensively and carefully managed, that the Europeans called wilderness. So native people have been operating with a different mindset for a long time. How long? There's a few archaeologists arguing that in South Africa, the area around the Claces River mouth has been managed for fire-dependent root vegetables for 100,000 years.
Wow.
There's a cave near the Claces River mouth that was inhabited for about 90,000 years consecutively. That's sustainability there. People lived in this cave for 90,000 years. A good-sized village, maybe, 800 to 1,000 people in one place for 90,000 years.
Wow.
So this has always been part of the human birthright. We are not simple takers from nature. We are manipulators of nature. And we don't have the option of not manipulating nature. That's not in our behavioral repertoire, and it's not an economic option anyways. So the question isn't will we manipulate nature, it is how will we manipulate nature. And I think we should, for example, in my region, we should have big areas that are hickory nut and sugar maple with an understory of ramps and mayapples and nettles managed that way because we eat those things.
Yeah.
And that would be a lot better than corn and soybeans.
Yeah, and you have to, and even I don't know if it is for you in the Midwest. For us, hickory really only produces like a decent crop every other year of seed. Like it doesn't consistently produce like a good mast every year. So it's like that's even something to consider when you're doing that.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, nut crops are inherently variable. So the casual observer of nut crops, they see the surplus over what wildlife eat, not the actual crop. So the actual crop isn't nearly as variable as we imagine it is, but because what we generally see is the leftover after rodents have eaten their fill, maybe 0, 0, 0, and then a lot, and then 0, a lot, and then 0, 0, a lot. Whereas the actual crop is what we're seeing is like the peaks of the wave, sometimes rising over that rodent, consumption level. So as soon as nuts are managed a little bit differently, like given appropriate spacing, then all of a sudden the crop appears to stabilize a lot more. So this is what we see in pecan orchards. A lot of people don't know that a very large portion of the world pecan supply until recently, the majority was actually wild pecans, not planted pecans. And you see the same thing when when they're managed that way. But yeah, I mean, the benefit of woody crops is that they're perennial, but the negative side of that is that they generally have built-in crop fluctuation as part of their reproduction strategy. But the idea that we should only take advantage of 20% or so of the food plants in the world, it just objectively doesn't seem like it can make sense. Like, you could say we had a whole continent of North America, and our food, what we eat on this continent today is maybe less than 1% food native to this continent. Like, what is mathematically or logically, what is the chances that the foods that worked best on this continent just happen to come from China and the Mediterranean region?
Yeah.
There's a really, really low chance of that.
No, it's funny you mentioned historical perception, too, because I immediately thought when you said savages, our founding fathers referred to the Native Americans as savages in the Declaration of Independence, but yet the Native Americans equally found it absurd, like the Europeans were coming over, they urinate in the stream and then go downstream and drink out of the same stream. It's just, it's funny, the perception of what is right, and it just seems like it was being done right here for so long until European intervention.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not saying Native people were perfect or anything either.
Oh, yeah.
And I am what I want to be clear about though is I'm using the word savage in the sense, not in its modern sense where it's basically like a naughty word, right? Savage meant hunter-gatherer in 1700. There wasn't any ambiguity about what it meant, and it also meant not human. And if you look at old anthropological literature, it's very clear that that's what the word meant. It meant hunter-gatherer and not human.
Wow.
And the arguments being put forth, so they weren't saying they weren't doing things right. They were saying they were not human beings, and therefore they were wild animals and could be eradicated. And that was the precise reason for that logic. And we've lost touch with what that word meant and what its function was because it was such a dark and ugly part of our history. But, I mean, there's anthropological articles from the 1850s literally calling for the utter extermination of every single non-white race from the face of the earth.
Wow.
Using the excuse that they're savage, which means they're not human, which means they can be eradicated.
Makes it okay.
And the term Aboriginal also has that origin. So Aboriginal means from a different origin. And what was being implied was that the biblical creation did not pertain to the people of Australia, Therefore, they did not have any rights that might be set forth in the Bible. Therefore, we could eradicate them. And so this is really deep in the Western psyche, and we haven't dug it out. We haven't pulled the skeleton out and dusted it off, and really dealt with it.
No, and I think some people don't want to deal with it, but I'm glad we're discussing it too.
Because it's
some people don't,
culture.
and it's okay with me. I'll bring up the ugly stuff, and I'll take the heat for it if I have to.
Yeah. But it's become such a part of our daily life, just from our food culture, that, like you mentioned in the very beginning, we kind of washed away some of the history of all these native foods that we have a lot of times right in our backyards, or things that we cut down to build our housing development that we live in. That was all food. And I love the example you use of the hickory nut canopy with the mayapple and the ramps and all that, because you think of a cornfield or you think of a soybean field, it's one crop that's harvested at one time, and where in your example, well, you have 3 or 4 different food sources there that are harvested all in different seasons, and for the most part are all perennial crops. You're planting it once, and you're going back year after year after year to just collect that harvest at those certain times.
And they're replenishing the soil, whereas agricultural crops are taking from the soil and depleting the soil, where these native cultures or groupings completely take care of themselves.
And they all feed off each other and help each other.
And we haven't even explored these. I mean, J. Russell Smith came out with the Tree Crops book in 1929, and we haven't even explored what he suggested then, but a silvopasture system with oil nut hickories spaced at 50% canopy. The production of beef, according to the University of Missouri, is with 50% hickory canopy versus no hickory canopy on permanent hill pasture land. The production of beef, 108% of the production without the trees. The production of grass, 95%. Okay, so the actually increased production of beef, but almost the same production of grass, and then there's the hickory crop, and then there's the soil stabilization, and there is the calcium pump of having the hickory's deep roots. Yeah. It's just like it's a no-brainer to try our native crops in intensive and extensive applications. I just feel like we can do so much better in every environmental metric, by using some of these native foods.
Yeah.
And I guess it kind of even ties into that concept of regenerative agriculture, where, and that was something Dr. Enrique Sala brought up as well, and we've talked about having another podcast episode kind of delving into that, even though it's less about native plants. But in your concept, it does involve a lot of native plants, and everything kind of feeds off each other, helps each other, is symbiotic, and with the cattle aspect, I'd assume you're getting a much higher quality meat, as well as getting that production out of it, because they're eating a better food than corn and soy and whatever else we're pumping into them in feedlots. So no, that's a very interesting concept.
Yeah, and when we talk about foraging, most of the information we have about foraging and most of the plants covered in our foraging field guides are, what I say, as I said before, farmer folk knowledge. These are plants gathered that grow inadvertently or spontaneously on the farm, right? Yeah. So these are most of our knowledge, or much of it, refers to plants that aren't even growing in natural plant communities, but inadvertently on farming land. And when you say, regenerative agriculture, I would say that encapsulates, like what I'm doing on my property, I would say is regenerative agriculture with mostly native plants. So my property, I have about 12 acres of abandoned cropland, and then another 12 or so acres of pasture land that had scattered trees growing up in the woods, and another section of actual woods it was wooded pasture though. So I'm restoring the native edible and non-edible things in my wooded area, and I'm planting. I have some apple trees in 5 acres, which was crop field when I bought it, And then there's crop field that was abandoned in the early 1980s that grew up with a pure stand of alder, which is native, but I'm using that as like a nurse tree to cover a diverse, native herbaceous understory, ramps, polkweed, all sorts of stuff. And then also planting, food-producing shrubs that are native and provide wildlife habitat. Wild plums, highbush cranberry, nannyberry, stuff, wild grape, elderberry, stuff like that. So, they can go hand in hand. And this is something that I'm not doing this to not be commercially viable. Like I'm selling food that I'm producing this way, and making a portion of my living at it. And it's something that I'm hoping other people can emulate.
The alders are a great choice too, just because they're nitrogen fixing. They're giving back in the same way a legume would to the soil.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and the alders are just what took over here. And I'm just I found out that they're actually a great nurse crop for the same understory vegetation that would grow in a mature, like old growth hardwood forest. Like ramps grow great under alders, for example.
Okay.
I was surprised to learn. And so I'm leaving them under the alders until they're well established, and then I'm putting hickories over the alders, and other larger trees.
We keep talking about native plants because that's what we do and that's what we promote, but exotic and invasives are as much a part of our culture today as almost as native plants. Some people, I think, can recognize more exotic plants than they can native plants. So do you actively forage from invasives or exotic plants as well as you're doing this? Like we like to promote native plants, and that's something that we can connect with because it's part of our heritage. But does this kind of seep in also?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I gather quite a few non-native plants.
Okay.
If I'm in an area that's got autumn olives, I'm going to pick them because they're great food.
Okay.
However, really the bulk of my relationship to the invasive plants is eradicating them, not because they're bad, but because I have native plants that I want to be living here.
Yeah.
So I have a place that I gather spring vegetables, and it's been recently invaded by garlic mustard, and I don't let garlic mustard grow there. And this is actually another reason we desperately need foragers on the landscape, because these non-native plants are here to stay. We have already culturally made the decision that we are not going to do anything about it. We could have, but we decided we weren't going to. So we might keep them out of a few parks, but in general, we're going to let them run free and take over the landscape. And that's already happened to the extent that it's the cat's out of the bag now.
Yeah.
And so if we are going to have any place with a native, what we would today consider a native plant community in 500 years, it will only be through the diligent and continuously applied effort of human hands. And I cannot envision any way that will ever happen on a large scale other than people having an economic relationship with food.
It's
this growing on that landscape. It's disheartening to hear this, but Amur honeysuckle and Japanese honeysuckle, they're here, and they are now part of the plant community of this continent. And so, my property, I don't have buckthorn here. I don't have Tartarian honeysuckle. I don't have common or glossy buckthorn, not because they weren't here, but because I don't let them grow here because I treasure what is here.
Yeah.
I have neighbors that are overrun with those plants. And honestly, other than if we want anything more than a few nature preserves to have native plant communities, it will be through foraging, and I cannot envision any other way it's going to happen.
Do you feel that there's countries that are more progressive than we are? Like I just learned today from Tom's brother that when he was in Switzerland, they actually had mushroom check-in points where they would go through what you're foraged and help you identify what you had and things like that, which to me is way more progressive than what we have here. Do you know of countries that are way ahead of the curve in what they're doing with this process?
I think that the United States, as far as developed countries, is probably the least culturally hospitable to foraging.
Wow.
It's way more socially acceptable in Europe in general, in Japan. And I don't, it's a lot of poorer countries in the world. It's an economic necessity, and there's no question of authorities interfering with foraging. But we're a very anti-foraging country. I mean, the Upper Mississippi National Wildlife Refuge allows all sorts of hunting and trapping and fishing. They don't allow us to harvest most of the unbelievable diversity of massive quantities of plants that grow there extremely vigorously. So I can pull out lotus or different plants to make a duck blind, but I can't legally eat those plants.
Wow.
So our entire concept of the relationship of humans to nature disfavors foraging in this country, and I'm hoping that we can see that change maybe within a generation. And we need a lot of, I think, foraging voices that also embrace conservation and just rationality to change that. Because I think you're very right. Europe, I think, is much more tolerant, and and it varies by state in this country too. Some states are I would say there's like 2 or 3 big centers of anti-foraging feelings in this country. It's New York City, it's Chicago, and it's L.A. The anti-foraging ethic in those large urban areas is quite powerful.
Wow. That's it's funny you mentioned that, because one of our listeners mentioned to us that in some states a fishing license is required just to harvest seaweed, and that posed like a whole nother line of questioning for us here before we even had this conversation with you. Like someone was asking us, if you were to collect oysters, technically is that no longer foraging? Is that hunting at that point? And some of these more saline saltwater or brackish communities.
Well, most people consider hunting and fishing as part of foraging.
Okay.
The term kind of was popularized first by anthropologists who certainly, use foraging as a term for hunting and gathering together.
Okay.
Use it as a kind of a replacement single word term to replace hunting and gathering, and then it kind of leaked from there into the general public in the late 90s. And most people that consider themselves foragers that hunt include hunting in their quote foraging, hunting and fishing.
Okay.
And I'm certainly one of them. So what we see with hunting regulations and fishing regulations is when the demand exceeds the supply, then you're required to get a license, or there's bag limit.
Okay.
So we may have, like in northern Wisconsin, snowshoe hares. Nobody wants to hunt them. There's no limit. There's year-round, as many as you want to shoot. Something like ruffed grouse that people really like to hunt, then there's a limit, 5 birds a day.
All right. Gotcha.
And so with foraging in Wisconsin, I'll just say, for example, there's 2 things you need a license to harvest. Ginseng, which is not for consumption generally, it's for sale, and then wild rice, because there's a lot of harvest pressure on the wild rice. Hickory nuts, that's something, it would be almost unthinkable to need a license to pick black walnuts or hickory nuts, because there's so many, there's no need to regulate it. I'm okay with the regulation of and the licensing requirements for things that are under a lot of pressure. Now, seashore foraging in some parts of the country is pretty intense and is regulated. I know in Oregon, there's pretty detailed regulations for what and when you can harvest as far as shellfish. I don't know about the seaweed regulations. I haven't harvested much seaweed in my life, but actually I get seaweed as gifts. So people who live on the coast are like, hey, Sam can't get seaweed, so let's send him seaweed. So I have tons of it that's been sent to me as gifts, which is really flattering.
We'll have to collect some Salicornia
but I have gathered very little.
Yeah, we'll collect some Salicornia for you when we go out and harvest smooth cordgrass seed. I know that grows along in with it. So,
I love Salicornia. Every time I come to the coast, I'll eat some Salicornia.
Yeah. Oh, awesome.
And that was, we kind of mentioned my brother is been my gateway into foraging, and he's been my guide. And sometimes I question him, do you really know what that is? Not, but he's been right 100%
so far.
Of the time,
He's
as far
100%
as I know,
right so far.
But he was texting me, or I said, hey, what questions do you have, to him yesterday? And he sent me some stuff this morning, and that was eventually he just sent me a picture of Salicornia, and I was like, well, I don't know if Sam's the right guy because he lives in Wisconsin. I'm not sure how familiar he is with the coast, but that was one of the things. But I don't know if my brother's even collected it yet, but now he's
interested.
He wants to get it. Yeah.
The one thing that I'm glad you touched on Sam, because we've had Ducks Unlimited on, and we've learned that when you buy your duck stamp, a lot of that goes into preservation. And a lot of this, it's kind of hard when you think of regulations, but a lot of it is to protect it and to also bolster it. So, and I completely agree. And it's interesting that you also mentioned that there's plenty of black walnuts, and we've lost it here in the Northeast when you think of how much of our forests were chestnuts and the chestnut mass that wildlife depended on. We've managed. There's still no shortage of these other other nuts, even without chestnuts.
Yeah, I mean, the landscape really produces a lot of food, and despite the idea that nature is really, really fragile, it's incredibly resilient. And we, so we have this idea of impact. Anything that a human does on the landscape is bad, but you could apply the same thing to a deer or a cottontail rabbit. They every time they go out there, they eat something, that thing is dead. But nature will fill that gap. So as long as people are paying attention, and not being wanton, you can harvest from nature and still have nature, and that's why really profound. But yeah, the nuts. I would love to be able to collect wild chestnuts, anything more than a few at a time.
Yeah.
The way we collect hickory nuts and acorns and walnuts now, and my grandchildren will probably be able to do that somewhere.
I hope so. They're doing a lot of strides in hybridizing the American chestnut to get it back. So one of
I'm not generally a proponent of GMO plants, but the State University of New York at Syracuse, their forestry school, has a GMO chestnut that has one gene from wheat to make it 100% resistant to chestnut blight. And if you ask the chestnut, do you want this gene or your species goes extinct, I think the chestnut says, give me that gene.
Yeah.
And I was totally a skeptic. I went on a tour of the facility, and I was completely converted. I thought, this is absolutely incredible. Like, this tree is now, it's not a hybrid. It's got one little tiny gene from wheat in there.
We've had the same conversation about American elm with Princeton elm.
Yeah.
I'd rather see that than no elm at all.
Right. And at least with American elm, they can survive to maturity and produce seed. So we know that if we have disturbance on the landscape, that the elms will fill those disturbances and eventually breed themselves naturally into resistance. Right?
Yeah.
Whereas the chestnut, this is not happening.
No.
So I was floored, at how I had never heard. They told us about the wonders of genetic engineering back in the 80s, what it was going to do. And what did it do? It gave us Roundup Ready crops. It allowed us to spray just loads and loads of herbicide and poison everything. Like, nothing good came out of it. This is the first good thing I've actually heard that's actually come out of, GMO. And it was done really carefully and thoughtfully with that in mind.
Yeah. It's funny when and that's something that we've lost that we no longer think about that is coming back. It's funny when I think of foraging and food, I don't always think of, I initially said I think of fruit or like mushrooms. I just experienced for the first time this year in my wood pile amber jelly roll, and had never experienced it. And I was like, oh, what's this? I got it all over myself and I'm wiping it off. And then I was curious about it and researched and found, I'm like, oh, this is edible. I had no idea. Just the amount of things that are edible and known that I had no idea of, that if you just look a little deeper, look a little further. Are there other things like that maybe we're not aware of, that, something like that amber jelly roll that's like, hey, there's things that if you just think about or look a little deeper that you'd be surprised?
There is so many that you would be surprised.
Okay.
I've been doing this for a long time, and a lot of people tell me, say that I am an expert on edible wild plants, but every year I discover one in my backyard. And, it's just astounding to me. Like, some of these traditions, I'm convinced, I'm certain of the fact that there are some great foods in Eastern North America, native here, for which the knowledge is completely dead. Nobody knows it's food. Nobody knows how it was used. It's gone. Because so many of them that we uncover are just hanging by this tiny little thread. And so everybody's got something in their yard that's a well-known edible, or 30 things in their yard that are well-known edibles. But just a couple examples. So we have this invasive plant from Asia, Scorsonero Liciniata, and Scorsonera is a genus related to dandelions and salsify that has edible roots, edible greens. You can buy them in some seed catalogs, and yet it is a really common. It's a really common weed on the high plains. From Montana all the way down to Texas. And nobody in the foraging community knew that. Even the people that were they're teaching foraging for a living didn't know this plant existed. I just happened to see it in my Great Plains flora, and it said common weed around Boulder, Colorado. And I was like, what? So I called a friend that lived there that teaches about foraging, and she's like, I never heard of that. I'm like, I described it. It said go find it along this roadside. She went there. 50 years later, after it was written, she said to me, I found it. It's really good. And so there is just this thing known as a food in Asia where it came from, totally unknown here.
Wow.
Another example is so there's this plant that looks quite a bit like water hemlock, which is the deadliest plant in North America. That's not something to screw around with, right? But Oxypolus rigidire, sometimes called stiff cowbane. Cowbane is another name for water hemlock. All of our literature says it's deadly poisonous. Well, some years ago I encountered an old Cherokee ethnography where one or two old women said we eat that. This was in the 50s. Women that were old in the 1950s remembered as a child.
Yeah.
We eat that. We call that swamp potato. We eat the tubers of it. And I thought, oh, wow. Well, I already knew this plant, and I was telling people it's deadly. I told myself it was deadly, but I was suspicious that it wasn't. So I found one other source to corroborate that, extremely obscure, and I went and I tried that. It's probably my favorite root vegetable, probably the best root vegetable I've ever eaten, right? And this is literally if any traditional knowledge is hanging by a thread, this is it. I mean, these were the people who refused to go on the Trail of Tears, hid in the southern Appalachians for a generation before they were, or more, until they were allowed to stay there. Those few people preserved that bit of knowledge. Otherwise, this plant culturally would be unknown. I would presume it was eaten over a very large area of its range in eastern North America, but there's no ethnography written for any tribe within the primary range of that plant, and except for the Cherokee. And so that knowledge is just about dead. Now it's something I've eaten intermittently for several years, and I think it's fabulous. It's not deadly. I'm telling you, it's not. Mm-hmm. It has no textural or scent or other similarities to water hemlock. It's just that people are like, oh, well, we're scared of it because it's in the carrot family, so we'll just call it deadly. And then this is what the colonial subjugation of knowledge looks like, right?
Yeah.
So there is big things, little things, obscure things, and not so obscure things. There is mysteries waiting to be solved all around us, and there's things that aren't mysteries that we just need to open our eyes to. In everybody's yard, everyone. I mean, I had a guy that was a police officer, came to a workshop of mine. He lived in Chicago, and I showed him wild parsnip. And he said, wow, that plant, it's amazing. I've never seen it before. And it's the same parsnip as the grocery store. I mean, and we cooked some up. He said, those are wonderful. He said, I wish we had these growing in the Chicago area. And I said, oh, you definitely do. He said, oh, this is so distinct. It's so big. I've never seen this before. I said, you will see it now. He called me the next day and said, when I got home, the fence in my backyard lined with parsnips.
Wow.
Wild parsnips, right? So these mysteries are they're all around us.
And I'm glad you're
never ceases to amaze me.
I'm glad you're keeping some of these alive. If you think just throughout time, information does get lost. No one really knows how the pyramids were built. That information just over time just gets gets lost. And you think of how many people had to, when it comes to food and deadly food, how many people had to die to figure out what you can eat, right? Like blowfish, like you have to cook it a certain way before, so that it's not deadly. And it's the same way with this, and the fact that it's being kept alive, that this knowledge, that's barely hanging on is still out there and being shared is huge. It's huge.
Yeah, and not only that, but we have so much food just right, like you said, in our backyards that we're really almost letting go to waste. It's a way to save a little money and enjoy something different that's just as nutritious, or probably even more nutritious than what you would be getting at the grocery store anyway.
And you think about how much food gets wasted a year.
Yeah.
Anyway, when you can just take what you need, harvest what you need, is phenomenal. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I could hear you were starting to say something.
I was going to say it's definitely more nutritious than what you can get, and that's the thing is we are now suffering from what they call the diseases of civilization. We're overfed and undernourished. Our food has about 40% the nutritional density that we're adapted for, and we are all constantly suffering from that. And foraging is an answer to that. I mean, a way of putting nutritionally dense foods back into our diets. And it's the most practical, most economical way to do that. So, it's not only something fun, and it's really fun, but it's also something really practical and really incredible medical benefits to it.
Yeah.
So I have two other questions that are just kind of in a different tangent. One is, are there any places you advise people to avoid foraging because it might be close to farm fields, or it's in a park where they spray certain stuff? Are there any places like that you try and tell people, hey, don't look over there, look someplace else?
That's a great question, and I'm super glad that you brought that up. So, back in the 70s, they would have said that the biggest thing that foragers should worry about is, lead from car exhaust. Today, it's herbicide. Most people don't realize how much herbicide is sprayed or how much is being used. I've been actually documenting it all over the country. I mean, we are seeing this utter destruction of native plant communities with aerial herbicide on a scale that's unimaginable to most people. And this is all over the place. It's not just in golf courses and lawns anymore. I mean, there's aerial spraying of millions of acres a year in Texas to kill mesquite, for example. And so you've got to try to figure out where stuff is and isn't being sprayed with herbicide. That's the big thing that I worry about. I was gathering cow parsnip on some public land in Pennsylvania with a group of people, and some Pennsylvania DNR employees came by, and they weren't sure the difference between cow parsnip, the native, and hogweed, the invasive. And so they told us that we just sprayed all that yesterday. And it hadn't showed up, it hadn't become physically evident in the spraying, and luckily we hadn't eaten any yet. Right?
Wow.
But I didn't expect it at all because it was an area with no hogweed. It was a native plant, and it was, yeah, that's scary.
Yeah.
Really scary. And I forget what they sprayed, but it wasn't Roundup. It was something way worse. So that's the thing to watch for. I mean, that's really what foragers need to worry about.
Okay. Did you have another?
And then
one?
I guess we addressed this a little bit earlier, but if someone is living in a development and they have their little postage stamp, what are some things that you'd recommend them planting just in the yard so they have something they can go outside and collect if they can't make it out to a wild place to go get stuff?
We have a lot of listeners that were very interested in permaculture. So that was, if there's a mushroom or a plant or something that you really recommend, that was a huge question that we got.
Gosh, I mean, it all depends on the soil and the size of your postage stamp and where you are. But I mean, one perennial plant, that's kind of a permanent perennial that's attractive. I'm gonna throw something out here that maybe people are think is crazy, but one of the most beautiful plants is polkweed. And I know houses that have a polkweed plant that they tend like an apple tree in the yard. People that actually eat poke greens every spring, and polkweed has to be boiled and drained to be eaten. But and maybe someone doesn't want that, but people come to my orchard and they see my polkweed and they say, can I get one of those plants? Those are beautiful.
Now that's
because we don't have polkweed in the wild around here.
That's one that has to be like you were mentioning.
There's so many options.
Yeah, that could be poisonous if it's not prepared correct. Am I right on that one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. If you eat polkweed raw, it's going to make you very ill.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. I feel bad. I have a giant one that's in my backyard that I've been cutting down every year. And now I only knew. I had to look it up, but didn't even think about it.
I believe the Indians used the berries for ink also, if I remember correctly. I'm not.
Yeah, in fact, my daughter writes letters in polkweed ink.
Wow.
Really?
Now she started doing that last summer. Somebody told her about it, and so she spilled it all over her bed a couple weeks ago.
But that's a great plant. I just read an article recently about the history of eating pokeweed.
Wow.
I can't remember who wrote it, or it wasn't that long ago. Yeah. I'm glad you brought that one up.
Yeah.
That's a great one, because for us in the Northeast, that's something we see fairly often.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, there's one factory that cans pokeweed commercially. There used to be another one in Arkansas. There's a city in Tennessee that still has a pokeweed festival. But you better make sure you cook it appropriately.
Mm-hmm.
You should boil it for 10 or 12 minutes and drain the water, and collect the greens only when they're young.
Okay.
So it's actually one of the best known wild leafy greens, but also one of the few that there's like a worry if you were to screw up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
And sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there. You were going to
I apologize.
say a couple other plants before we got in your way.
Oh, I mean, there's just so many. It's hard to say. I mean, but a lot of the beauty of a perennial plant is that you put one in and you have it for a very long time. But you also, if you want like weedy plants that are gonna, like weedy native plants that are reseed themselves, I like American bellflower. And it's gorgeous, or Campanulastrum americanum, and the shoots are delicious. And one plant will produce thousands and thousands of seeds. So if you've got a little patch and you've got 30 plants, you just let one or two go to seed. We have a bunch of, we do that with black nightshade in our garden too, which the ripe berries are excellent. We always throw the seeds around the garden so that if they come up where we don't need to get rid of them, we'll let them go. So later in the season, we get all the berries every, September and October. So, I mean, you can incorporate the wild annuals and perennials into landscaping so easy. There's just so many of them.
How many the plants that you forage, is that a common practice where you'll keep the seeds and reestablish them?
Yeah, I mean, like for example, say like ramps. I've got a lot on my property, but I bet you, I've tripled the amount of ramps on my properties since I've been here just by planting. If I can, and it's not inconvenient, I will. But the other half of tending is not just planting, but is removing competition, right? So I may see a bush that I really like, even something I don't eat, like a alternate leaf dogwood, and I think, what? There's a couple white ash saplings around this alternate leaf dogwood, and I'm going to cut them out next time I'm doing firewood, because I have 20,000 white ash saplings and I have one pagoda dogwood. And so that's the other way that somebody can regulate the plant community on their landscape to increase diversity.
Awesome.
But I do both.
All right, very cool. I think we're down. We've taken so much of your time, and I think we're down to our final question, which we did discuss before we went on the air, and we
had to make some concessions again,
and that's okay. But we thought we'd make it two-part, and I'm sure both are equally just as hard. We always ask, what is your favorite native plant? And we were curious if you had a favorite food to forage. And I know it's difficult to pick just one. It's like picking a favorite child, which is impossible. But even if you could just give a couple, like if you have a couple favorite native plants, if you want to do different categories, or favorite foods to forage, if you have any that come to mind.
Well, I mean, one that comes to mind is that bitternut or yellowbud hickory, just because the idea that I've got in my pantry right now 5 gallons of the best cooking oil that I have ever tasted, and it came from this tree that grows all over my property that people think is worthless. and I can gather up 15 gallons of those nuts in an hour when I get a good crop.
Wow.
I mean, to me, that's just awesome. I mean, it's just incredible. You know, so, you know, I don't like to pick favorites, and in 2 years, somebody else will say a different tree is my favorite.
Oh,
But
in
I've been
another
talking
hour.
about that one a lot for the last few years.
I'm curious to see how many of our listeners seek that out after this episode or look into that. I'd be curious.
Oh, I'm on his
Are you?
website right now looking to get some.
That's awesome.
So right now, we're the only people commercially making the oil. The only people that I know of making the oil in the United States. But I've been trying for 15 years to get other people to do it, and I got a person in Maryland who has an oil press, and they made some this year for themselves. And I got a guy in Vermont interested who's going to be doing it soon, and someone in North Carolina. So it's I think in a decade you're going to be able to buy hickory oil from a lot of places, or better yet, like local co-ops. Right? I got people who bring me nuts, and I press the oil for them, and I keep 1/3 and I give them 2/3.
Awesome.
And you know, so that's great. There's no investment. The forager they gather up something and they get awesome cooking oil.
That's wonderful.
So I think you're going to see it grow.
I love that. All right, so we always end the show with a final thought, and we each get a turn. And what we kind of do is we give you the floor. You get to, if you want to, you can use it however you want. If you want to summarize or promote something, or just leave, follow up on something or mention something we didn't cover, you can use the time however you want. But the floor is yours.
It's the best food in the world. Why not eat it?
Very true.
Yeah,
very true.
And for me, that's basically what I was going to say. Is it's something that is accessible to almost everyone. If you've been thinking about it, or even if you haven't been thinking about it, now's the time to go out and do this. And there's a great resource. There's more than just one great resource out there, but one of them is Sam's book, The Forager's Harvest. And that's a great place to start with identifying and just knowing, giving you that first step. Go look in your backyard, try and figure out what stuff is, and get his book so that you can try and figure out what it is and take that step and eat it.
Well, I think for my final thought, I'm interested, for someone that chose native plants as a living, I'm constantly reminded how much I don't know. Mm-hmm. And this is just another aspect of it. Now I'm very competitive, and now I need to know. So I'm looking forward to learning more and sharing with everyone as I'm learning as well. So that's part of the process. Are there, I just thought of this, are there like foraging groups that are good or a good resource where people get together and share this information?
I know of one kind of small, low-key foraging club in the United States.
Wow.
Wow. And people are looking to expand that. They have there's a fledgling club that's in Wisconsin. There's one in Indiana that's kind of forming now, and they're talking about maybe making a network of these groups. There's more than 100 mushroom clubs in the United States.
Wow.
So to learn the mushrooms, you do have a great resource of people getting together for that purpose. But for plants, I'm hoping that it forms. There's a number of online groups, and I don't know much about them because I honestly don't participate.
I honestly, other than our Facebook group for this podcast, which I love the group of people that we have, and they're kind and polite and very helpful and listen, I don't really participate in any other native plant groups. I've been every time
for similar reasons.
Every time I peek my nose in, I'm like, nah, I'm not interested.
So there's a few yearly events focused on foraging that are great. There's one called the North Carolina Wild Food Weekend.
Okay.
And that's held usually in late April. It'd be about 100, 120 people or something like that at that event. Great event, great people. Way to learn, way to feel like you're not abnormal because there's 100 people around you that are into the same thing. And then my wife organizes one in southwestern Wisconsin, kind of in the Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa corner there.
All right.
Called the Midwest Wild Harvest Festival. And she brings in instructors from all over the Midwest and a couple from further. even me, she lets me come and teach
Oh,
there.
nice.
Yeah, and so that's like a 1 weekend a year thing, but it is a blast, and it's a great way to learn. Last year's was canceled. I'm not even sure how this year's is going to go, but I think it'll happen. I don't know.
I'm hoping. I'm hoping. Well, I think hands down I learned more this episode than I have any of the previous episodes.
I'm excited for spring to kind of roll around so I can get out and start trying some of this stuff and
me also.
Really get rolling on it.
Me also.
So with that, we thank you guys for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed listening to Sam Thayer. For more information, make sure you visit his website, which is www.foragersharvest.com. When you're there, he has a lot of the stuff he's even been talking about for sale on his website, in addition to all his great books. He's got Hickory Oil on there. They have like different fruit leathers, all sorts of stuff up there. You also have a really good Facebook page, which is facebook.com/foragersharvest. Thank you guys for listening again to Native Plants Healthy Planet, presented by Pinelands Nursery.
And we will make sure that we share all those links on the website when we post the episode of the podcast. We need to give a big, huge shout out to Egocentric Plastic Men for contributing our new theme music to Meet Their Guest episodes. You can follow us on Twitter at Pineland Nursery, Facebook at Pinelands Nursery NJ, Instagram at Pinelands Nursery. Also, YouTube, we need 9 more followers, people, to get 9 more followers to hit our number that we've been reaching for. Don't forget about the question and comment line. Call us at 215-346-6189. I will repeat that, 215-346-6189. Ask a question. If we pick your question or comment, we'll play it and answer it on a future episode of The Buzz. We actually have a surprise. We got a few calls in for the next Buzz, and we're going to phone a friend for an answer. So, and let's not forget about our Native Plants Healthy Planet Facebook group. A ton of new members this week, and the conversation's been wonderful. So keep it going.
Yeah, you can listen to Native Plants Healthy Planet directly at www.nativeplantshealthyplanet.com. You can also check us out on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, Stitcher, really wherever you consume your podcasts. When you're there, do us a favor, leave a 5-star review, subscribe, and definitely refer a friend, because and if you're going to refer a friend, this is a great episode to send them and say, hey, listen to this, because there's a lot of great information coming out of there. Last but not least, you can always listen to us on Alexa by saying, Alexa, play the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast. Thanks again, everyone. I'm Tom.
And I am Fran. Samuel, thank you so much for being with us today. We enjoyed every moment of this. Thank you again, everyone. And we'll see you soon coming up with another Buzz. So until then, keep it native.
Thank you for listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Remember to like, share, follow, and comment.